Today's podcast will tell us the story of Australia's worst child killer. She was hailed as Australia's worst murderer. However, she was recently released from prison. How did this happen? Was she guilty, or was it a huge miscarriage of justice? Judge for yourself. Kathleen Folbigg was born on June 14, 1967 as Kathleen Megan Donovan. Her parents were Kathleen Donovan and Thomas Britton. They did not devote much time to their daughter. Her earliest childhood was spent with her aunt and uncle. Mr. and Mrs. Platt even wanted to adopt her, but the girl's mother categorically refused to sign the papers. They succeeded only in 1969, under tragic circumstances, when Kathleen's father murdered her mother. He stabbed her 24 times with a knife. When she was already dead, he apologized and kissed her. He claimed that he had to do it, otherwise she would have murdered their daughter. Shortly thereafter, something else came to light. Kathleen, who was less than 3 years old, began to exhibit behavior that could suggest she had been molested. She often cried, screamed, and could not be calmed down, and these suspicions were indeed confirmed. The culprit turned out to be her degenerate father. Kathleen had to be placed under professional care. Later, she was taken care of by Mr. and Mrs. Marlborough. She was not an easy child to care for. By the age of 16, she had already dropped out of school to take one of the many jobs that required little skill and for which she was paid low wages. She lived with Mr. and Mrs. Marlborough until 1985. That's when she learned the truth about her mother's death. Until then they had tried to hide it from her. She experienced a shock. She finally left her subsequent adoptive parents at the age of 17. There were no tender goodbyes. She simply ran away from home one day. During this period she even happened to steal. She also met her future husband at that time. Craig Folbigg was employed in the steel industry. They married in September 1987. The following year Kathleen became pregnant, which went without any complications. On February 1, 1989, the healthy mother gave birth to a healthy, as it seemed at the time, boy, who was named Caleb. Just 4 days after the birth, problems began. Mother and child returned to the hospital because, while nursing her son, Kathleen noticed that Caleb was having trouble breathing. He was examined and sent back with a harmless-sounding diagnosis, lazy larynx. However, 2 weeks later, around 3 a.m., Craig was roused from sleep by his wife's shrill scream. He found her standing distraught over their son. The boy was dead. So-called sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS, was identified as the cause of his death. A few months later, Kathleen became pregnant again. On June 3, 1990, Patrick was born, who on the surface also appeared to be a healthy baby. The tragedy didn't happen until October 19. Once again Craig was awakened by Kathleen's screams. Patrick had stopped breathing. This time the father decided not to give up and began CPR. The parents called an ambulance. At the hospital, it turned out that Patrick has serious health problems. He suffers from epilepsy. In addition, it was found that he was blind. Perhaps Kathleen began to break down then. She wrote in her diary that she felt like running away. About 2 years after Caleb's death, on February 13, 1991, Craig received a phone call at work from a terrified Kathleen, who screamed that it had happened again. He arrived home at about the same time as the ambulance, but nothing more could be done. This time, the death of Mr. and Mrs. Folbigg's son was linked to an epilepsy attack. The couple moved to Thornton, 160 kilometers north of Sydney. Kathleen Folbigg became pregnant for the 3rd time. On October 14, 1992, she gave birth to a daughter, who was named Sarah Kathleen. Doctors knew the medical history of Mr. and Mrs. Folbigg's sons, and this time they decided to blow the whistle. They thoroughly examined the girl. They even hooked her up to a monitoring device for apnea. It seemed that everything was normal, so after 11 months they gave up monitoring the baby's breathing. At the end of the summer, Sarah caught a cold and had trouble sleeping. Nothing unusual, however, the nightmare was to return. On August 30, 1993, she too suddenly stopped breathing. What could have happened this time? An autopsy was performed and signs of suffocation were found. However, she was again considered to have died of natural causes. Several years passed before Kathleen and Craig decided to have a child again. By then they were living in Singleton. On August 7, 1997, Kathleen gave birth to Laura. The daughter seemed healthy, but was also constantly examined and monitored as a precaution. Laura even celebrated her first birthday. But then came March 1, 1999. An ambulance called to the scene found a sobbing Kathleen beside her daughter. She tried to resuscitate her. However, attempts at CPR were no longer able to save her. The cause of death? Determining it proved problematic, since for SIDS Laura had already lived too long. In the meantime, Kathleen had left Craig, who one day discovered her diaries in one of his desks. As he stated, they made him want to vomit. In them, she expressed jealousy over her husband's attention. She mentioned that she felt guilty about Caleb and Patrick's appearance and had mixed feelings about Sarah. Sometimes she just wished the girl would just shut up. Toward Laura she was sometimes impulsive. And then there's this statement, "Clearly I am my father's daughter." The diaries ended up in the hands of the police. An official investigation was launched, which lasted as long as 2 years. Tests conducted showed no genetic burden in the 4 children. SIDS also did not quite fit as the cause of their deaths. Finally, on April 19, 2001, Kathleen Folbigg was arrested. She was put on trial. The defense tried to argue that the children were sickly and weak, but could not rule out that they had been strangled. Besides, it was pointed out that at their funerals the mother showed no signs of grief. Finally, on March 21, 2003, she was found guilty of 3 murders, Patrick, Sarah and Laura, and 1 homicide, Caleb. She was originally sentenced to 40 years in prison, but after an appeal her sentence was reduced to 30 years with the possibility of applying for release only after 25. Newspapers began calling Kathleen Folbigg Australia's worst murderer. In prison, she was under special surveillance because of the potential danger from other inmates. She, on the other hand, maintained throughout that she was innocent. The fact is that she was convicted without relying on any direct evidence. And there were more and more doubts, especially in the world of science. Specifically, genetics, which has advanced considerably in the meantime. The first significant step toward the potential release of Kathleen Folbigg was an appeal in March 2021 by 90 leading experts on the issue. On what grounds? Well, in 2018 the genomes of her children were sequenced. The research showed that Sarah and Laura had a fairly rare mutation of the COM2 gene, which has been linked to the risk of arrhythmia and even sudden cardiac death. Caleb and Patrick, on the other hand, were found to have a mutation in the BSN gene, linked to epilepsy. The case eventually found its finale in June 2023. Based on the new scientific evidence, New South Wales prosecutor Michael Delaney decided that Kathleen Folbigg be unconditionally released from prison. It should be emphasized here that the aforementioned findings do not provide a clear answer to the question of the cause of her children's deaths. However, they strongly indicate that they were not necessarily homicides. In fact, as one expert and criminal justice program director at the University of South Australia Dr. Ben Livings pointed out, the indictment against Kathleen Folbigg was based mainly on the improbability that all 4 of her children died of natural causes. So after 20 years, has justice been served thanks to scientific advances? What is your opinion on this case? Thanks for listening.